Hi students, we'll be going over lesson 4.09 and we'll be going over the concept of succession. So succession is basically the gradual change in species composition in an ecosystem. So when we talk about species composition, we're talking about the species makeup. So with succession, what happens is that there is a change in what species are making up that ecosystem. There are actually two types of successions we're going to be talking about today. We'll be talking about the primary succession as well as the secondary succession. So let's first look at the primary succession. So the primary succession brings the first new organisms to an area devoid of life. And what it means for an area to be devoid of life means that it does not have any life that existed there beforehand. So you might be thinking, are there even any places on land where no life exists? And there are a couple. It's not that common, but for example, we have lava fields. And lava fields are created after a volcano erupts. And so that lava, when it cools, it's going to cool into this sterile rock. This sterile rock doesn't have any life that exists on it, but it really doesn't take long for that life to come. For example, there could be seeds that are in the wind or in animal droppings that arrive to the lava rock, and eventually what will happen is we'll see these simple plants rooted in the topsoil, and then eventually we'll see different types of vegetation and then other types of more complex organisms. The first plants and animals to inhabit the bare ground is what we call pioneer species, and that's because, again, they're the first organisms to inhabit this land. So generally when we have the first signs of life, they're usually low-growing plants. So plants such as the one that you see right here. Over long periods of time, then we'll see more trees, possibly, and other types of organisms as well. Another example besides the lava fields of primary succession are glaciers. So glaciers, when they melt away, they expose this land that has never really been inhabited. So we can consider this primary succession as well, because any plant or animals that come into this space would be a pioneer species. Alright, so we talked about primary succession and we also have secondary succession. So primary, you can kind of think of as first, right? So primary succession is when we have those pioneer species coming in, being the first organisms to inhabitate this new land. But if we have but in secondary succession, what we have is one community of organisms are replacing another. And so we see that we have this change in the ecosystem. So here's an example. Here there's a forest fire, and obviously after a forest fire we have many things burnt, some organisms that possibly died as well, and so there's obviously going to be some sort of change in this ecosystem. One example of this would be in the Yellowstone National Park fire in 1988. There was definitely a lot of trees that were burnt down, lots of different vegetation as well as organisms. And so after that happened, eventually there were different plants and animals that began to grow and live in this area. And when those plants and animals came in, we consider that secondary succession because they're taking over an ecosystem that was once in place. Secondary succession usually occurs after an extreme natural event, just like the Yellowstone fire that we just talked about. Not only did the biotic factors like the trees and other organisms die, but also the abiotic factors were involved as well. For example, the topsoil that is needed in order to grow this vegetation obviously was damaged and was covered in hot ash. However, over a period of time, even though much of the land was covered in ash, there was secondary succession that did occur in this area. So this is an example of what Yellowstone looked like afterwards. One of the first types of plants that started to grow was something called fireweed. And you can see it's in this portion right here. And you see that there are low-growing plants, and those typically are the first types of vegetation that you see in secondary succession. Secondary succession actually can occur much more quickly than primary succession, because remember, secondary is just organisms replacing the existing community that was in the ecosystem before the natural event. However, in primary succession, because we're introducing pioneer species that are living in the area for the first time, that definitely takes much more time. In secondary succession, some plants are able to return quickly since the topsoil is still present. So that's why the grasses, the flowers, and the moss are the ones that appear first. So once we have these low-growing plants that come in, eventually they're going to be overtaken by taller bushes. And the reason why they're overtaken by taller bushes is because those bushes are going to cast a shade on these plants, and then those taller bushes would then outcompete the low-growing plants for sunlight. And so you see that even though these fireweed plants are the first ones to come, eventually taller, bigger bushes will replace them. So we see another example of secondary succession would be the disappearance of a pond. So let's say we had a pond and we had birds that were attracted to this pond, and they flew over this pond often. A lot of times birds bring seeds along with them, whether it be in their droppings, on their wings, etc. And they can drop those seeds into the pond. Eventually, these seeds that could have arrived by these birds or by the wind can actually take root at the edge or even at the bottom of the pond. And so what will happen are that plants will, from the outside, will start to grow, and plants in the center of the pond will start to grow as well. And so instead of a pond, right, it starts to turn more into like a marsh. And as succession continues, and years go by, the marsh can eventually transform to a soil-filled land. So it looks like as if a pond never existed. And so this process could take a long time, like hundreds of years, but it's still an example of secondary succession because we have new organisms like these new plants that these birds are introducing, taking over the existing organisms in the ecosystem. Another example of secondary succession would be something like an abandoned farmland. So in order to clear land for a farm, oftentimes farmers are clearing trees and other plants in forests. And so let's say after years of farming, the farm is then abandoned, then what happens is secondary succession can start to begin. And it's going to actually start looking like the forest that it was before. So what will happen is at the edge of the farm there might be seedlings that originate from the forest, and those grow into saplings, will eventually grow into trees. And those trees we know are habitats for many birds and mammals, so that will attract other organisms from the forest, and eventually that field will start resembling more and more of the original forest that the farmer's ancestors cut down. So through secondary succession, the forest has taken over the field. This example of secondary succession is pretty cool. This is on an island called Christmas Island, which is located in the Indian Ocean off the northern coast of Australia. And this example of secondary succession has involves non-native invasive species. So different species and organisms that don't originally live in that specific ecosystem can lead to secondary succession. So here we see an example of some yellow crazy ants, and these yellow crazy ants destroyed the native land crab population. So in this way, we have a non-native species coming into this ecosystem in the Christmas Island and overtaking a native species. And so we see this replacement of the makeup of the species in this ecosystem, so we consider this secondary succession. Another example would be these giant reeds. So these giant reeds, because they're so big, they outcompete the smaller native plant species for sunlight, so these non-native reeds are really changing the entire habitat. And lastly, we have these goats, and these goats have taken over a lot of the island because they're eating every plant in sight, and so they're causing an imbalance in the ecosystem. And so again, all of these changes really affect the organisms that once originated on the Christmas Island, so we definitely consider this secondary succession. The last concept we need to go over is climax vegetation or climax community. And so obviously in the beginning of primary or secondary succession, there aren't that many plants or organisms that live in that habitat or ecosystem. However, after many, many years, sometimes hundreds of years, the ecosystem will reach a point of maturity. And when we know that this point of maturity is reached is when we have a balance of organisms that exist. So what happens is at this point, there aren't many changes that happen to the balance of organisms. Once this state is reached, we call this the climax community. The species of plants in the community are called climax vegetation. So obviously there isn't a set time that all ecosystems follow to reach this climax community. The length of time really to reestablish the climax community really depends on the ecosystem and the resources that are available. In Yellowstone, even though it happened in 1988, it's still an ongoing process. The climax community for each ecosystem on the planet is different. So to kind of sum everything up, remember we went over a definition for succession, which is a gradual change in the makeup of species. We went over two different types of successions. We went over primary and secondary succession. Primary succession is unique because it happens on bare land, remember, where there was no life before. Whereas secondary succession occurs in a disturbed ecosystem. So we are replacing the organisms that once lived there with new organisms after some sort of natural event. So some important vocabulary that you need to know is primary succession. Remember, that's when we're starting on ground that has never had living things on it. Then we have secondary succession, which is a succession that occurs where vegetation existed previously. So we have that replacement. And the last term you need to know is the climax community, which is a stable, long-lasting community that results from succession. And remember that climax community can be achieved at different lengths of time depending on the resources available in an ecosystem.